We are at Desert View, which is the eastern end of the Grand Canyon. And it's called Desert View because when you look to the east, you're looking out into the painted desert. And you can maybe see a little bit of that beyond the watchtower there. So this is about a quarter of the way into the Grand Canyon. It starts about 70 miles east of here, and from here it has another 200 miles to run to the west. And so right here is when the canyon first starts to really widen and deepen and sort of turn into the classic views that you see in most photographs or calendars or famous images. So before now it's a much narrower gorge, and then when it reaches Desert View it really opens out, and so it's about 10 miles wide here and it's about a mile deep, has another 200 miles to run to the west before it eventually ends up at Lake Mead. The Colorado River, I hope you can see that in the bottom, runs all the way from the Rocky Mountains to between California and Arizona as it heads south. So and you can see the tower over there, which is called the Desert View Watchtower, and it is sort of a tribute to the Hopi tribe. It's not really there to see the canyon better. It's 70 feet tall, so you get a slightly better view from the top, but it's really there to be a monument to the Hopi tribe. The Hopis are one of the most famous tribes in America. They live in Arizona, about 50 miles east of here, and they used to live here in the Grand Canyon. Their ancestors used to live and farm inside the Grand Canyon about 1,000 years ago. They were part of a very widespread culture that we today call ancestral Puebloan. Back then, they used to be called Anasazi. So the Hopis have a very long, deep connection with the Grand Canyon, partly from living here, and it's still very sacred to them. So this is where they believe that humans emerged into this world, and they believe the souls of their dead return into the Grand Canyon to reach the afterlife. So the Hopis have deeper ties to the canyon than really any other group of people. It isn't all that often that science and ancient mythology agree on something, but actually science has sort of verified the Hopis' perspective that this was a place of creation. So science would agree that we're at least seeing the forces of creation here. This is probably the best place on Earth to see the forces of creation, of forces of nature from which life and humans emerged. So you're seeing, first of all, you're seeing deep time here. You're seeing almost 2 billion years of rocks here. The bottom rocks in the Grand Canyon are almost 2 billion years old, 800 million years old, almost 2 billion years old. And you're seeing all sorts of geological forces. You're seeing tectonic action, which is why all the sand was lifted up as high as it is to begin with. You're seeing rock formations, a lot of it happened under the ocean, and it was lifted up by tectonic forces. You're seeing a lot of faulting action. You're seeing a lot of erosion. The Grand Canyon, of course, is like the classic statement in the world of the power of erosion to create landscapes. And there's all sorts of features inside the canyon that were created by erosion. And then you're also seeing biological evolution here. So the rock layers here preserve a lot of biological evolution. One of the layers here preserves what's called the Cambrian explosion, where life first became very complicated, went from very simple shapes to very complicated shapes. So that whole idea that this is an ultimate place has gripped a lot of people, and I think it still touches tourists today. A lot of people come here just expecting sort of a grand visual spectacle of some sort, but they end up feeling something more than that. Their sense of the creation of primordial forces is stirred by visiting here, and it comes out differently with different people. So if you're very religious, you might see God here, and different Christians see God in different ways. Some will even see Noah's flood as carving the Grand Canyon, and non-religious people may just see the forces of nature, and that can touch them as well, because we spend most of our lives in cities and jobs and families. We have these social identities that seem to be everything. There's nothing outside of our social identities, and people come here and they see that there really is this much grander reality beyond their lives that that their lives came out of. So even non-religious people end up having a somewhat religious experience here sometimes. So now we're standing out on what's called the Hermit Road, which is west of Grand Canyon Village, and we're at Powell Point, and there's a Powell Memorial just off to my side here, which is a memorial to John Wesley Powell. He was the first river explorer here back in 1869, and he was sort of a passionate geologist. He just wanted to come out and explore the canyon's geology and put together a do-it-yourself trip. You know, he was a teacher at Illinois Wesleyan University, didn't get much support from the federal government. Most explorations of the American West were federally sponsored, you know, because they had national import, which, you know, hopefully meant they would bring back maybe new territory or new economic resources or new transportation routes. And the nation wasn't convinced that the Grand Canyon was worth all that much, so Powell got almost no support for his expedition. So he put it together on his own and had 9 other crew members, at least to start out with, and a few of them got disgruntled along the way and left. And in fact, there was a controversy about that because there's a plaque up on the memorial there, and there's 3 names that were left off who did almost all of the trip, but at the end of the trip they decided that they'd had enough, so they walked off to some of the Mormon villages in Utah and were never seen again. And one of the people who organized the memorial to Powell thought that they, you know, were disloyal to Powell, and they were a little bit hero worshippers of Powell. So, you know, they thought these 3 guys that disappeared were, you know, deserters or cowards, and they didn't deserve to be on the plaque. But anyway, so they're missing, and that's always been a source of controversy among river runners. But anyway, so Powell did succeed, and he went back to Washington and became a pretty important national leader. Became head of the U.S. Geological Survey for some years, and founder of the U.S. Bureau of Ethnology, which is studying Native American tribes. Powell was actually far more sympathetic to Native American tribes in that era in the late 1800s than almost any Americans were. So he thought their cultures were interesting and were worth studying, and their languages were worth preserving before a lot of them were already starting to disappear. But Powell's maybe biggest contribution in his Washington career was that he sounded a warning about our future national growth and our patterns and our assumptions about national growth. So Americans always had a sense of destiny about, you know, settling the frontier. You know, it was a God-given domain for us to settle and become prosperous, and the settlement patterns that had worked in the East, namely the Homestead Act gave out acreage, 160-acre farms to anybody who could claim them, and you know, a lot of that was very successful. But Powell saw, when he came out to explore the Colorado Rockies and then the Southwest in the 1860s, he saw that that just wasn't going to work further west. So there just simply wasn't enough water west of the 100th meridian. Was pretty much the line he defined as the line where farming could not succeed, at least not on the scale that it had in the East or in the Midwest. So he tried to sound the warning to the country that the type of settlement practices that had been successful in the Midwest were simply not going to work in the far west. Certainly in the Southwest, which is very arid, there was just no way that a farm of 160 acres in Arizona was ever going to be able to succeed. There just wasn't any water sources for a lot of places, and the soil wasn't all that great. And he sounded that warning. He made it clear that water was really the secret to settlement of the West, and a lot of the country just did not want to hear that at all, because Powell was basically saying you're never going to settle a lot of the western United States. The price to be paid was there was hundreds of thousands of farmers that came to the High Plains in the 1880s, 1890s who tried to farm, and it just were miserable failures, even under normal conditions. And then when you had some years of drought in the 1890s, it was a disaster. So Powell was a environmental prophet before his time, and I'm not sure we're still quite hearing that message when it comes to water resources, because we're still in the Southwest, we're really living beyond our means. The Colorado River is at the bottom of the Grand Canyon that carved the canyon. It seems like a very powerful river, but it's not that big of a river compared to a lot of eastern rivers. It doesn't have that big a volume of water. So it's now supporting, 25 or 30 million people, and a lot of agricultural areas don't have any other major water source besides the Colorado River. And the demands on the river, the legal obligations it's supposed to meet, are already beyond what it actually has to supply. So the water, even under normal conditions, just doesn't have enough. The Colorado River doesn't have enough water to meet all the demands on it. And lately we've been in a drought mode. We've been in a drought for about 20 years now. So the river has been going downward. Lake Powell, which is ahead of the Grand Canyon, upstream from the Grand Canyon, is down to about 50%, and Lake Mead, which is below the Grand Canyon, is down to about 40%. And we're not very far away from where we're going to have a water crisis, where the water supply to towns like Phoenix and Tucson is going to start being cut off, and they really don't have any great alternative source. And Las Vegas is involved as well, and agriculture in southern California and the Imperial Valley depends entirely on Colorado River water. So, we're not that far away from having a major water crisis. So Powell realized that, water was going to be the defining limit of Western settlement, and the country's still not really learned that lesson. So now you might imagine we're standing in some Native American village somewhere, because you can see a pueblo behind us. But we're still at the Grand Canyon. We're actually in the heart of Grand Canyon Village, where most of the tourists congregate. And this building is called Hopi House. It's a recreation of a Hopi home. It is exactly what the name says it is. It was a home for Hopis, and there were actually real Hopis who lived here for many years. There was a family that lived upstairs, and they performed dances. There's a little pavilion right next to me, and they made pottery inside, and they talked to tourists. So they lived upstairs. So it really was a home for a Hopi family that lived here for, I think, about 20 some years. And this was built by Mary Coulter. This is the very first building she designed from scratch. And this building makes quite a contrast with the building right next to us, which is the fancy hotel here, El Tovar Hotel, which was built. They were built at the same time and opened in 1905. And they sort of make a big contrast that sort of defines some of the values of the American West and what people were looking for in the American West. So Mary Coulter built this to honor them, and this is the first building she designed. She didn't have much of an architecture training and no architecture license. At that time, around 1900, it was almost impossible for women to get architectural training or get into architecture school. And she was a high school teacher in St. Paul, Minnesota in her early 30s. And the Santa Fe Railroad sort of crossed paths with her, and they decided this lady has a lot of imagination, and maybe she's a genius, and we need somebody like that to design some of our buildings. We want some sort of Native American style in our southwestern buildings. So, the Park Service, when it started out, they were a very small agency. They didn't have a whole lot of support. It took them a long time just to get a Park Service founded. There were national parks for decades before there was actually a Park Service, and they were a very small agency. And they realized, and there were still a lot of threats to the parks and to places that should have been parks, but there were mining companies and other interests that didn't want them to be national parks. So the Park Service set out early on to create a political constituency that would support the creation of new parks, and would support better protection for parks and better buildings, museums, and ranger programs and things like that inside parks. And the Park Service was very small, very low budget. So they spent a lot of their first decades just encouraging tourism. So they were happy to work with the railroads to get tourists out to the west. Most Americans lived in the east, and all the national parks are in the west. So the only way tourists could get here in the teens and 1920s was on railroads. So the Park Service was very much in the tourism business. There was a senator from Indiana, Benjamin Harrison, who had never, I don't think he ever visited the Grand Canyon in his life, but for some reason, which we don't quite understand, he was very devoted to trying to make the Grand Canyon a national park. So 3 times he proposed bills to make it a national park. And Harrison became president in the 1880s, and he again tried to make it a national park, and he couldn't get Congress to go along with that, because it takes an act of Congress to create a national park. So there was a lot of opposition from Arizonans, because this land had been privately claimed, and they didn't want to see private land claimed by the pioneers taken away from the pioneers and turned into public land. So Benjamin Harrison couldn't do it even when he was president. He did make this a national forest, though. He did manage to make the Grand Canyon a national forest, which is sort of bogus, because inside the canyon there's not very many forests inside the canyon, up on the rim. So that was one step forward. And then Teddy Roosevelt came along. He was very dedicated to the Grand Canyon too. He really loved it, but in a very paradoxical way. So Teddy Roosevelt, after he was president, he went to the North Rim to go mountain lion hunting. He was a big game hunter, so he went to the North Rim, and there used to be a lot of mountain lions there, and there were hundreds of them that were killed over the years. The Forest Service actually hired a ranger to kill the mountain lions, And nobody was quite thinking ecologically then, and thinking what happens if you kill all the predators? Well, the prey, the deer, are going to explode. So there was this massive population explosion in deer. But anyway, Teddy Roosevelt, loved hunting, but he still loved the canyon for other reasons, and he tried his best to make this a national park, and he couldn't persuade Arizonans or Congress to make it a national park. So in 1908, he made it a national monument, which a president can do just by signing a bill. So that gave it certain protections, but it was still a lower level of protection than he wanted. So it didn't remove all the private mining claims or ranching claims or timber claims on the rim of the canyon. So he was dead for a few months before Grand Canyon finally became a national park in 1919. He never lived to see it. He always regretted he didn't succeed in making it a national park. And so it finally became a park, partly just because the railroad was here first and was bringing in tourists, and they loved it, and tourists were bringing in money, and Arizona businessmen were noticing, hey, this is worth more than those mines in the canyon, which are not producing anything anyway, and it's worth a lot more than ranching, so why exactly are we opposing making this a national park? So, gradually as tourism started up, it sort of swung opinions around to realizing this had economic value, and people certainly saw the natural value of it as well, but a lot of power brokers in Arizona just didn't seem to see that. It took a very long time to see that. Well, today, I think last year we got like 6 million visitors here at the canyon, and in around 2000 it was flirting with the 5 million level, up and down, and lately it's been up. Actually, a lot of national parks have been up in visitation, and that's put a lot of stress on the parks because a lot of them just don't have the capacity to absorb that, at least gracefully. And a lot of them are foreigners. There's a lot of people from overseas who just love our national parks, and they come here with the main goal of their trips as seeing the Yosemite or the Grand Canyon or maybe Yellowstone and possibly Death Valley, and they might throw in San Francisco or Hollywood or maybe Las Vegas along the way, but it's mainly about national parks, and they go home really loving the parks and saying how great America is. Even people who have some sort of gripe about America, politically or culturally, they may not approve of McDonald's or whatever, they go home telling people how great the parks are, and this was an American idea. It was a very democratic idea, because otherwise, it's the idea that the land belongs to all of us, and it will be so in the future. Otherwise, the whole rim of the canyon could be a very long series of gated communities with security guards with guns, to keep everybody away. It's a pretty profoundly democratic idea that we can all be proud of, even though today the country is pretty divided. But that's one thing that both liberals and conservatives really should be taking pride in. We've done a really good job with our national parks. I guess if there's one message I like people, readers or viewers to leave with, it's just the idea, the Woody Guthrie song, "This land belongs to you and me." This place belongs to us, and it's our birthright at this point, and we shouldn't be looking at it through books. We should be getting out and visiting it ourselves and having our own experiences, and it's a great place to explore, and certainly everybody should try to plan a trip here at some point in their lives. It's never too late.